Open your Bibles, please, to Daniel chapter 1. Going to go, I don't know how long it'll take, a few months to go through the book of Daniel. 12 chapters long. Written by who? Daniel. Hey, that's right. Very good. Daniel was, for me, the book that sort of got me really switched on for God. And so it has a near and dear place in my heart. But I really haven't looked at it seriously I was thinking like 10 years. I'd look on the calendar and go, whoa, you haven't looked at this book in a long time. So it's been kind of fun to sort of rediscover some things and see some things that I've never seen before, because that's how it is, right? You read God's Word and it's alive, and it never stops changing. It never stops showing you new things. And one of the new things that it showed me, not new in the sense that it's new doctrine, but it's new for me, and hope it's new for you too, is that when you read it, there's this sort of collision between the sovereignty of God and the free will of man. Because it's a book of prophecy, right? And what is prophecy but God's word? God laying out his will. This is what's going to happen, right? I mean, he tells the future. He's written the future. He says, this is what's going to happen. But then you also see woven into it man's will, man's choices as to how he's going to react to what God's will is, what God's sovereignty is versus man's. So there's this kind of collision, and it struck me. It's like, because usually Daniel's known as this amazing book of prophecy. It's all about the 70 weeks, and it's all about, the weird animals and the bear with the bones in its mouth. It's weird stuff. But there's some really practical elements when you think about it in terms of it's God's sovereignty, but it's also can show us how people react to that. Some try to fight it, some go with it. And those who go with it are living life on purpose. When you have that in mind, going into the rest of your life, seeing how God does things, you can choose to live life on purpose. So let's just take a quick moment and talk about that idea of this conflict, this contradiction that we have. What is the sovereignty of God? All kinds of ways to talk about it. Some people talk about it in terms of God orchestrating events, right? God makes certain things happen. Or some people talk about it in terms of God allowing certain things to happen, right? Especially when something bad happens. Like, why did God allow this? Or they'll ask, why did God make this happen? Did God make me get cancer? Or did God allow me to have cancer? And you know what the answer is? It's all of it. I mean, really, when you take a step back and think about it, the sovereignty of God is actually, before the script of eternity was written. Well, no, I'm sorry. It's God writing out this script before he says action. That's what you see in Genesis 1. God said, right? That's when he says action. But before all he even did that, the script was written out in advance. So that's God's sovereignty. It's history already done. God doesn't have a calendar. He doesn't have a day timer. He's not, going, oh, I better go show up in Foursquare right now to do something. He's not waiting for that to happen. It's already done, but at the same time, he's involved. So even that's kind of a weird conundrum. And then you have us, who are going through life, going through making choices, doing things, reacting things, making our own plans. Like, I'm going to go to college. I'm going to go get this job. I'm going to go do this. And we have our plans. We're going to wait so long to have kids. Yeah, right. God's in control, my friends. We react to God's will. We make our plans, and then when something happens we aren't expecting, we go, God, why aren't you in my plan? I had this thing all planned out, and why isn't this happening? Why isn't it going the way I want it to go? And when we get all stressed out, it's because we are trying to put our plan in front of God's. It's because we are fighting what God has already established instead of taking a step back and go, okay, God, I have some idea of what I want to do, but whatever you want to do, let's do that. Let's just take a step back and let you do your thing. It's you saying, God, I give up. Your plan is better. Let's do your plan instead. So when these two things are at odds, our lives feel like things are in pieces. Lose a job, your kid gets sick, whatever. It's like you just feel lost. You feel left out. Whereas if we take a step back from that and decide, okay, God, I'm going to live my life for you no matter what. When those events happen, well, there might be a moment of stress, but we can really go, okay, I'm cool. It's all right. You get that peace that passes all understanding that Jesus talks about, or Paul talks about later on in one of his epistles. When we live life on purpose, we can have that peace despite our circumstances. So when there's this battle between the two, who wins? God does. He just because God's bigger than you or me. So what we need to do is work and cook and play and earn and spend and learn and teach and go about our lives the way we normally would, but do so living life on purpose. Not living life with purpose, but living life on purpose. Having a plan going into life, deciding how we're going to react to things when they happen. We're going to see a lot of that in Daniel, how people fight against God's plan and how people go with God's plan. So that's that kind of conceptual introduction. You have a handout that has a lot of other introductory facts about the book, so take some time, not right now, because you got to listen to me. Go blah, blah, blah. No, read that, give that a look over. But basically, it's 605 BC when the book begins. Long time ago, right? No electricity. No internet. Internet. I can't go like 5 minutes without checking my email. No telephones. No cars. No airplanes. It's a completely different time. And it's not that it's primitive. It's not like these ancient primitive people. They really had a different kind of technology than we have today. Because they could build things that we can't figure out how they built. They could move rocks that we can't lift or move today with our most sophisticated equipment. So it was a completely different kind of technology. It wasn't this low primitive culture. It was a very high culture. They had art, they had science, they had literature, they had everything we have today. Very highly developed kind of culture and society with laws and it was pretty sophisticated. So don't think of this time as this low tech, primitive, Gilligan's Island sort of environment. That's not what it is. But what I want you to do now is take that image and now put yourself in Daniel's place. Again, it's 605 BC. You're from the tribe of Judah. You're living in Israel. And this army went through not too long ago from Babylon to beat up on Egypt. And they did. But on the way back, they decided to beat up on you. So in 605, Nebuchadnezzar, who was the king of Babylon, having just beaten up on Egypt, is coming back through Israel on his way back to Babylon, and he puts a siege around the city. And a siege is where they surround the city and try to starve and drown, or not drown, starve and no water, no food can get in so that you'll surrender. That's what he did. And that's where the book starts, is this event. So it says in Daniel 1:1, in the third year of the reign of King Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. There it is. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the articles of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar, which is Babylon, to the house of his God. And he brought the articles into the treasure house of his God. So there it is. You can read, if you want to read about it, in 2 Chronicles 36, starting at verse 5. It touches on this, specifically this guy named Jehoiakim and how Nebuchadnezzar came on through and took him out. That was the first of actually 3 sieges. Because instead of coming in and trying to dominate and just level the place, what he liked to do is set up sort of a puppet government. He didn't want to come in and dominate. He wanted to come in and say, I'm in charge now. You're going to pay me taxes, but you can kind of go on with life as normal. Just recognize that I'm your king now. And so he sets up this sort of puppet kingdom once, tries again, and then the third time, because they rebelled each one of these times, he just says, okay, that's it. And he just levels the place, levels the temple, levels the city. So this in verse 1 and 2, it's the first of those 3 sieges. And the way people functioned sort of in their minds back then was this. If an army comes and fights another army, whoever wins, the god of that army is better than the god of the one who lost. So it's like our God is better than your God, kind of a thing. So here's Nebuchadnezzar, and his idols and his false gods come through and win. Conquer Jerusalem, conquer the city, conquer Israel. And so the mindset that the Babylonians would have had is our God is better than your God. Your God lost. And I'm sure the Jews would have felt, what happened? How did our God parted the Red Sea and he did all those miracles in the wilderness, and we have this stuff written down and we're supposed to read it all the time to remind us of how awesome and powerful God is. Where did God go? Well, the answer is in verse 2. And who gave Jehoiakim into his hand? The Lord did. God was there. God didn't lose. He wasn't taking a nap. He didn't stop taking his vitamins and get weak and suddenly he didn't win the war. He willingly gave Jehoiakim and Judah and Israel into the hand of King Nebuchadnezzar. In fact, go to 2 Chronicles 36. If you find Psalms, it's just a little bit to the left. And 36 is the last chapter, so if you're like, where is it? I can't find it. These pages are so thin. It's the very last chapter of 2 Chronicles. 36, starting at verse 15. And this is that third siege now that I mentioned a second ago. It says, and the Lord God of their fathers sent warnings to them by his messengers. There it is, God warning them, rising up early and sending them because he had compassion on his people and on his dwelling place. So you see, God's trying, at least, to warn them and to say, guys, you got to repent, you got to straighten this out. 16, but they mocked the messengers of God, despised his words, and scoffed at his prophets until the wrath of the Lord arose against his people, so there was no remedy. Therefore, he brought against them the king of the Chaldeans, which is Nebuchadnezzar, who killed their young men with the sword in the house of the sanctuary and had no compassion on young man or virgin, on the aged or the weak. He gave them all into his hand. God gave them all into the king's hand. And all the articles from the house of God, great and small, the treasures of the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king and of his leaders, all these he took to Babylon. Then he burned the house of God. So this is that temple that Solomon built, that was supposed to be the most amazing thing ever built, burned to the ground, broke down the wall of Jerusalem, burned all its palaces with fire, and destroyed all its precious possessions. And those who escaped from the sword he carried away to Babylon, where they became servants to him and his sons until the rule of the kingdom of Persia, to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed her Sabbaths. As long as she lay desolate, she kept Sabbath to fulfill 70 years. So here we get the why. Why did God do this? It's, again, back in Daniel, it says God gave them over. You had this first siege where they kind of come in and they do take some people and they do take some stuff, but they don't take everybody. They don't kill everybody. It comes in stages. Nebuchadnezzar's trying to just rule a peaceful kingdom, but the Jews would not recognize that God is the one who was doing this and just submit and to surrender to his will. But at the end of that, it talks about how Jeremiah, the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah, that the land was going to enjoy her Sabbaths. So we understand the idea of a Sabbath being, you have 6 days you work, and the seventh you shall rest. It's part of the 10 Commandments, right? Well, there wasn't just a week of Sabbath. There was also a year of Sabbaths. You were to work the land for 6 years, and the seventh year, you didn't work it. It was supposed to lay fallow. It was supposed to, you didn't plow it, you didn't turn it, you didn't do anything to it, just let it grow wild for a year so that the land could recoup. Because you can outwork a piece of land. And so 7 years you could work it. In the 6th year you would get an extra crop. The 7th year you didn't touch it. You just let it go. But what happened was, and that was every 7 years that was supposed to happen. But what happened though is the Israelites didn't do that. They worked it every year, every 7, they never gave it a break. And so God said, okay, you know what? You're breaking my law. I'm going to give the land a break. So I'm going to kick you out of the land for as many years as you have worked it, which is 70. So that means, you do the math, for 490 years, again, every 7 years, they didn't give the land its rest. So now it was going to have 70 consecutive years of rest. I'm going to boot you out, and this is the word of the Lord to Jeremiah. So this is why it says God gave King Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand. This is all God's will. This isn't, they had sinned. They had broken his will. They weren't doing what they were supposed to do. So God is the one who did the giving. God was not defeated, nor was his will overturned. So this is God's sovereignty playing out. This is what he said was going to happen. If you didn't, in fact, if you can go back to the law in Leviticus and see this exactly, that if you don't give the land its rest, I will give it its rest. I will do what it takes to make that happen. So this is God doing it. So verse 3. Then the king, Nebuchadnezzar, instructed Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, to bring some of the children of Israel and some of the king's descendants and some of the nobles, young men in whom there was no blemish, but good-looking, gifted in all wisdom, possessing knowledge, and quick to understand, who had ability to serve in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the language and the literature of the Chaldeans. And the king appointed for them a daily provision of the king's delicacies and of the wine which he drank, and 3 years of training for them, so that at the end of that time they might serve before the king. So, Daniel is amongst this group that is taken captive back in that first siege from Israel to Babylon. When we see this word eunuch, it doesn't always mean what we first think of what it means. It can mean, someone who has been physically castrated so that they serve a special function in the king's house to guard certain things. It can mean that. It can also just mean an officer. The Potiphar, back in Genesis, who worked for Pharaoh and Joseph in that whole story, he was called a eunuch, but he was married. He had a wife and family. So it can be that. It can also just be an officer. We don't know what this guy was specifically, but just for your information, file that away. Someday God might use that. I don't know. But he was looking for specific qualities. So let's look at some of the qualities in these young men he was looking for. So verse 4, first of all, young men in whom there was no blemish, but good looking. So he's looking for some hotties. He's looking for some young, steadily, good looking guys to do this job. Because, they're going to serve before the king. They're not going to be like butlers and pillow fluffers and flower boys. You're going to be like advisors and servants to the king. And king doesn't want to look at anybody ugly, I guess. He wants to have some good-looking people around to advise him. What else? Possessing knowledge and quick to understand. So not only good-looking, but smart. Don't always go together, do they? Sometimes, like, ooh. Some exceptions are, no, I'm kidding. Wow. An example of what it's not. Oh, I'll go home and Jess will put me in my place and we'll be okay. Love you, baby. Thank you. Oh, everybody. Oh. What was I talking about? Oh yeah, you got to be smart and you got to be good looking. So, chocolate and peanut butter. You got peanut butter in my chocolate. Anyway, food. It all comes back to food and chocolate for me. They're supposed to serve the king, and it says there in the middle of verse 4, to serve in the king's palace, of whom they might teach the language and literature of the Chaldeans. So they're going to take these good-looking, smart guys, and they're going to teach them all the history of the Chaldeans, all the literature, and all the language, so that they can speak the king's language in this and understand the history and understand the culture and be basically advisors to the king. Verse 5, and the king appointed for them a daily provision. So they're not going to get like the regular rations. They're going to get the king's food, the choice meats, the choice foods, the choice wine. They're going to be treated as royalty to serve before the king. They're basically going to go to 3 years of Babylon University. That's what it is, 3 years of Babylonian school and of the right food, and then come out and work in the palace, work for the king. And what he liked to do, and this isn't just this isolated to Nebuchadnezzar, but a lot of kings do this. In fact, even Hitler had a similar program, is what people would do when they would go conquer another country, is they would take the leadership or leadership potential people, like in this case the royal and the nobles' families, and retrain them, re-educate them. We'll see that they're going to get new names in a little bit so that the general population of who was conquered would know who to follow. Be like, well, they took all the people we're used to following, and they're going along, so we'll just go along with them. Does that make sense? That's basically what he's doing. He's going to educate them so that they can lead. And again, Hitler did the same thing. He would find the youth, the Hitler Youth Program, and re-educate them and retrain them and teach them the right language, and so that they could be examples to the other youth, so there wouldn't be any rebellions or uprisings and so forth. Because it is like he tried to do. It's easier to have followers than those you dominate. It takes a lot more effort and work and resources to dominate a population than it does just to retrain them and have them follow you willingly. It's a lot easier to do that, and that's what he was trying to do. But ultimately, the Jews didn't do that, and he had to wipe out the whole place. And then verse 6. Now from among those of the sons of Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. To them, the chief of the eunuchs gave names. He gave Daniel the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah Shadrach, to Mishael Meshach, and to Azariah Abednego. He gives them new names. You know, what's in a name? Well, a lot. Your identity, right? If somebody calls your name, you turn your head. If you're in a place where there's different people who have your name, somebody says that name, you're like, what? No, I get all kind. Somebody says Courtney, I turn my head. Don't know why. It just happens because it sounds like my name. Have you ever tried to go by a different name? Not just to be weird, but because. And I think I've shared this before, but I'll share it again. First year of college, I grew up going by Corby. All my whole life, Corby. And when there was a substitute teacher coming to the class, they would go down the list for roll call, and they'd come to Charles. And everyone's like, who's Charles? And I'm like, me. It's my first name, Charles. But nobody calls me that. And so every time, oh, Charles. Really annoying. And when you go to introduce yourself with this name, people are like, what? You go to Papa Murphy's to get a pizza. And they're like, okay, can I have your name, please? Corby. They go, and I just spell it every time, C-O-R-B-Y, because it's just annoying. What is that, Corey? Corby? Corey? Corky? What? It's not fun. So first year of college, I was like, clean break. Nobody knows me except for my roommate, who was a kid I kind of grew up with. I can go by Chuck. Exactly. Thank you. It's a strong name, Chuck. People laugh. And I pull it off for a while. Introduce myself. What's your name? Chuck. There's no, what? What? That's a weird name. Chuck. And for like most of the first quarter, I get away with it. It's, hey, Chuck. Everybody, hey, Chuck. It's like, yes, this is so much easier. This is so much more peaceful. Until, dun, dun, dun. It's one afternoon. I live in a dorm called Haggett Hall, University of Washington, and there's this common area in the middle, and you have these hallways where the rooms are up the side, and there's a TV area in that common area. We used to love to watch the Animaniacs, 1991, right? Watch the Animaniacs, and we all knew the song, and it was really dorky, but we all sang the song with the Animaniacs, and we did the whole thing, right? And then out of the hallway comes my roommate, and he says, Corby, phone for you. And everyone's like, and I'm like, it's me. And they're all like, Corby. Chuck died that day. There's no more Chuck. Never came back, never came up again. But your name is your identity, right? You can't travel now without having the right documentation that says you are you, and it has to have your name on it, and everything that has your name on it has to match. And if you have a name like somebody else's name, you can be in trouble. Like I flew back from England one time, and my name, I'm at Newark Airport, and they slide my thing through, and it goes like beep, beep. I'm like, oh, crud. I'm not a terrorist, but sir, could you go stand over here? And I wait. Sir, can you come into our office? I'm like, it's like, a year after 9/11, and I just sit there, and they're up in this like glass booth. You can see, not even dark in the windows, you can see them up there talking and yapping. I'm like going, that night I got to catch a plane. But they come back out and they tell me that I have the same name and same birth date as somebody else they're looking for, but it's not me. I'm like, okay, good. Yay, freedom. But your name is everything. And you grow up with it. It's what you're called. It's your identity. And here they give these guys new names, which is a new identity. You have to think differently. Not only just a new name in the same language, a new name in a whole other language. And all these guys' names, Daniel, I can't remember the other names. Daniel, where are they? Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, they all have to do with God. Daniel means God is my judge. You see, where is it? Hananiah, that ayah, that Yah, that's Yahweh, that's Jehovah. It has to do with God. Same with Mishael, the El is God, and Azariah, God. These are all godly names, but their new names all have to do with Babylonian gods. So not only is their name different, it has a whole different cultural connection for them. So put yourself in this place, right? You are a young Jewish man. You've grown up with the Jewish tradition and the law and the stories, and And in this case, these guys really do love God, and we'll see that soon. But this other army comes in and takes you captive. Maybe you're thinking God's left you. Maybe you're thinking you don't know what's going on. And you go back, and suddenly you're pulled out of this big pool of people to learn a new language, to learn a new culture, and you're given a new name. Would anybody else be overwhelmed? I'd be like, overload. What are you doing to me? You have to learn all this stuff. That's the position they're in. Completely world turned upside down, all because this is exactly what God wants, which is also important to keep in mind for them. So that's where they're at. And then, verse 8, but Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's delicacies, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the chief of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. But Daniel purposed in his heart. And this is the first suggestion on how to live life on purpose. Purpose in your heart. This word for purpose means to put, to establish, to nail down. So he's like nailing down, rooting, anchoring in his heart that he's not going to be defiled with the king's food. And I find that interesting because he was going to be learning everything else about this culture. He was going to learn their language. He was going to learn all of their magic spells. He was going to learn their interpretation of what we call the zodiac and what all the stars mean and how to interpret them and the times and the seasons. And you're going to have a good month and you're going to have a bad month. And he was going to learn all that stuff. But for him, he decided that it was the king's food he was going to stay away from, that he would not defile himself with. And it's interesting because all that other stuff was also contrary to God's law. God says, go into the land, but don't learn the ways of the nations around you, because I'm setting you apart as a holy nation, as a light, as an example. Don't intermarry with them. Don't bring their culture into the culture I'm giving you, which is totally unique, totally different, totally separate. But for whatever reason, and I can't answer why, only Daniel knows for sure, he chose that area to keep himself set apart and separate and pure from everything else. You know, and contrast that with what Jesus said. Jesus said it's not what goes in the mouth that defiles a man, it's what comes out. But here, Daniel seems to be worried about what's going in. So it's kind of this weird, not a contradiction, it's just a different way of approaching. He told Peter the same thing. He wants Peter to go and minister to the Gentiles. And Jews didn't go hang out with Gentiles. And so he sends that vision 3 times of this big white sheet full of unclean, according to the law, animals. He sends it down 3 times and he says, Peter, kill and eat. And Peter says, nothing doing. Those are unclean animals. And 3 times this thing happens. And each time Jesus says, don't call unclean what I have called clean. And so Peter finally figures it out because it takes him 3 times and goes and preaches to the Gentiles. But Daniel decided that this is one area where I don't want to compromise, and it's just for me. And it's interesting, he wasn't being asked to deny his God, was he? At no point do we see them coming in saying, you know what, your God doesn't exist, he's not real, so you have to deny him or we'll kill you. That's not part of it. It's just we're going to teach you all of this other stuff because to the king, even the Jewish culture would have been value to him. Because if he was having trouble with any of the Jewish population, who's he going to go to? Daniel and his boys to say, why are they doing this? How can I address this problem? They would have known. So he wasn't trying to squash their culture. He was just trying to add them in, add to the diversity, so to speak. But it was this area, for whatever reason, Daniel chose, I'm not going to defile myself with king's food. So here's what I want you to do. Well, before that, what did Daniel, did he lash out at God? No. Did he reject God and do his own thing? Which would have been tempting. It's like, God, you lost. What happened? Did he rebel against those in authority over him? No, he wasn't like, well, I'm a Jew and I can't do this stuff, so forget you. Didn't do that at all. Did he do his best to serve them? Absolutely he did. Did he do his best to serve God where he was? Absolutely he did. See, this chapter in particular, I think, could really stress out somebody who's very legalistic. When you think about it, speaking as a former legalistaholic. I just made up that word. I don't know if it's a word now, so work it into your vocabulary. No, he didn't. He obeyed God right where he was. Did his best to do that. So he purposed in his heart this area in particular. Well, let's see what else he does. Verse 9. Now God had brought Daniel into the favor and goodwill of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who has appointed your food and drink. For why should he see your faces looking worse than the young men who are your age? Then you would endanger my head before the king. Looking out for number one. So Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days, and let them give us vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance be examined before you, and the appearance of the young men who eat the portion of the king's delicacies. As you see fit, so deal with your servants. So he consented with them in this matter and tested them 10 days. And at the end of the 10 days, their features appeared better and fatter in flesh than all the young men who ate the portion of the king's delicacies. Thus the steward took away their portion of delicacies and the wine which they drank and gave them vegetables. So back to verse 9. I love it. Now God brought Daniel into the favor. Who did? God did. Kind of reminds you of Joseph, if you've read that story. God brought Joseph into the favor of Potiphar, into the favor of the jailer, and it was just God orchestrating all these things. So he basically says, test us. So we're not going to eat this king stuff, even though it's looking pretty good. What I want you to do is to give us vegetables and water. And this guy's like, time out. If you just eat vegetables and water, you're going to look worse than all the other guys your age who were doing the same exact thing. Because, from a dietary perspective, if you just eat vegetables and drink water, and you have these other guys who were eating like steak and drinking wine, who's going to look healthier after a while? The other guys are going to look a little fatter. They're going to look a little beefier, and you're going to be all skinny and scrawny and not cool. But he says 10 days. Give us 10 days. And the guy says, okay, fine. And that's what it says in verse 14. So he consented with them in this matter and tested them 10 days. Now notice this. This was Daniel's conviction in his heart. And I guess apparently it looks like it's the other three guys with him, right? Did Daniel somehow tell all of the other Hebrews, this is what you have to do? Don't eat the king's food. Did he push his own conviction on anybody else? And being a leader, he could have done that potentially. He could have said, okay, all the Israelites, don't eat their food, just eat vegetables and drink water. He didn't push it on anybody else. He did what God felt. He did what he felt God would have him do. His own conviction in this particular matter for his own conscience sake. So add that in. How to live life on purpose. Number 2, make your convictions your own. Don't expect them from or enforce them on anyone else. And that is tough. Again, from my own background, I'm speaking from a legalistic perspective. Because when you have something that you think this is the way it should be, what do you want to do? You're a Christian? Don't do this. You have to do that. You want to tell everybody you want to make, and you stand at a distance and say, well, those Christians aren't doing it, so they're less than me. They don't get it. They don't get this holiness thing like I get it, and I'm superior, and I'm better. Daniel didn't do that. It's not how it works. He had his own conviction. He didn't expect it from anybody else, nor did he enforce it on anyone else. This was just his own thing. And something else that's interesting, at least interesting to me, is that Daniel and his friends were strangers in this place, weren't they? This wasn't their home. Didn't grow up there. They're strangers in this strange land. This world is strange. It's totally different from their normal environment. And as Christians, it's kind of the same for us. At least it should be. Granted, we're born, a lot of people just grow up in the world and we're familiar with this world, but something happens at salvation. Something happens when you come to faith in Jesus. And Paul says, he puts it this way, we're no longer citizens of this earth. Our citizenship is in heaven. That's where we're from. Our politics is literally are in heaven. This is no longer home. He also talks about how we're We're strangers in this land. We're sojourners. We're travelers like Abraham was in the land of Canaan. We're kind of the same thing. And as believers, we can kind of put ourselves in this situation and ask ourselves, are we more familiar with the ways of the world or with our new kingdom? What's more familiar for us? What's more comfortable for us? Do we feel more comfortable just fitting into the world and doing things their way, or is that wrong? Is that off to us? We're supposed to be in the world, but we're not supposed to be of it. We're supposed to be agents of change. We talked about in Thessalonians, in the world. We're agents of influence to bring people closer to God, not to fit in and blend in. It's like, yes, Jesus went and hung out with sinners and tax collectors and prostitutes, but he didn't just go hang out and play Game Boy with them. He didn't just go hang out and have a drink. He didn't just hang out and go, hey, how you guys doing? Good to see you. I'm going to go sleep under the tree now. Every time we see him in those positions, he's challenging them. He's confronting them. In fact, they're the ones who invite him over because he's saying some weird stuff. They invite him into their house to effectively beat up on them. To effectively say, your life is lost. You're messed up. Believe in me. So whenever Jesus was in those environments, he wasn't just chilling, hanging out. He wasn't gelling with those cool gel things in the commercial. Right? He wasn't doing that, and he didn't have gel sandals, walking down the street. Sorry, commercial note in my head. He didn't do any of that. He went as an agent of change. He went to influence. He went to draw people to himself, and that's what God wants to do with us. So they're strangers in this strange land. We ought to be too. And if you find yourself, as you think about this, and maybe God brings it to your attention throughout the week or whatever, that you're like, man, I feel real comfortable in this world environment. That's not right. That doesn't seem right to me. And so what you can do is ask yourself, what are some things that are unclean meat in your life? What are some things that maybe you are compromising on, but you haven't really thought about it before? Because again, Daniel had this whole spectrum of things that he was going to be taking in that were contrary to what God wanted for him, but he chose this one to keep himself set apart. So just for your own sake, ask God to teach you, ask the Spirit to say, shine that big old holiness flashlight in your heart and say, what's hiding in here? What are some of the things that I'm hanging on to that maybe I shouldn't be hanging on to? And again, this isn't legalism. This is the question of holiness. And the difference between legalism and holiness is where your heart is. Are you abstaining from certain things because it's a rule you've made for yourself, or are you abstaining from certain things because it will help you keep clear communication with God? That's the question. That's the way to look at it. At least that's the way Daniel was looking at it. So verse 17. They got the water and they got the vegetables, and that sounds awful to me. But as for these 4 young men, God gave them knowledge and skill in all literature and wisdom. And Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. Now at the end of the days, when the king had said that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. Then the king interviewed them, and among them all, none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they served before the king. And in all matters of wisdom and understanding about which the king examined them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers who were in all his realm. Thus Daniel continued until the first year of King Cyrus. So how to live life on purpose. Tip number 3. Do what God has put in front of you to do with everything you have, and let him worry about his own plan. Do what God has put in front of you to do with everything you have, and let him worry about his own plan. Surrender your sovereignty, as it were, to God's sovereignty. When the things come down in your life and you're thinking, this is not what I had planned, this is not what I wanted, and you find yourself fighting with God, instead, do whatever it is that's happening to the best of your ability to best represent God. I mean, think about this. Daniel is at Babylon University, Again, I'll say it again, learning all of the astrology, learning all the language, learning all the magic spells, all the incantations, all of their prophecies of all of their various religions. He's learning all of this stuff, and when he comes out, he's 10 times better than anybody else in his class, and he and his boys are better than anyone in the whole realm of Babylon. Whoa. Okay, let me give you an example of how not to do this. Freshman year of high school, earth science class. I'm a relatively new believer. I started doing the Christian thing in middle school, and freshman year, and I'm in this big youth group in Vancouver, and it's fun and exciting. And I want to live for God. And the science teacher, Mrs. Ramsey, where'd that come from? Oh my gosh. We used to call her the Dragon Lady because she must have smoked a whole tobacco plant an hour. Just this breath that was come on, you'd be like, I don't want to go talk to her in front of the class. It's nasty. Dragon Lady, a little bit taller than Lois. God bless you, Lois. And just had this gait about her, and she science class, and she hated God. You could totally tell she hated God because on tests she would do things like this. It was a multiple choice. How old is the universe? 3.5 billion years. And if you're a science fan now, you go, wait a minute, it's 4.5 billion years. It changes, doesn't it? Almost 20 years ago, 20 years ago, the Earth's aged 1 billion years. But I digress. 3.5 billion, 3.5 million, 350,000, or 6,000. Multiple choice. Guess which one was wrong? That kind of Bible-managing answer, right? Put there deliberately to make a point, this is wrong. Now, being the Christian and wanting to represent God, having multiple choice, I circled the 6,000. And guess what? I got it wrong. Big old red mark, wrong, on the test, right? What should I have done? I should have put the answer that they wanted. I should have done the best that I could with the information on hand because that's what Daniel did. I call this the Daniel principle. So when you go to school, you're in school, taking these classes, and you come across questions like this, like Daniel would have, you give the answer you're supposed to give, and you can do that without compromising your integrity. We have an optometry school here in town, and it's your eyeball. And there's all these shows on TV about the evolution of the eye, which is just hilarious. This little critter somehow developed a dark spot that was sensitive to light. But how did that dark spot connect to a brain, and how did the brain interpret? How did it learn? All those things had to be in place at one time for that to happen. So it kills me. But there might be questions on that subject about these things, and you need to put the answer that is the right answer for the test to best represent God. Because to show, I'm a Christian, I can answer these things and still be secure in my faith and come out top of my class. And then say, even though I put these things, here's what I really believe. And maybe you'll have a chance later on to do that. So, you guys in school, you can do that. You can answer the way they want you to answer and maintain your integrity with God and then still be an example. But that's what he had to do. And he came out on top. Now again, why would they have gone along with this when it was contrary to God's law? Why would God have blessed them like this? Go back to verse 2. What does it say? And the Lord gave. This was God's will. This was God's plan. And instead of fighting God's will and fighting God's plan, they said, this is where we're at. This is what's going on. This is where God has put us. So we are going to live life on purpose for God at this time where he has us. That's what he was doing. And what does that tell you about what God desires from us? Think about that. What does that tell you about what does God want from us? Does he want our own rules? Does he want us to represent him our way? Does he want us to represent him his way? These are the kinds of things we have to think about. In situations like this, if you ever find yourself, taken captive by Canada or something, came and invaded America. God bless Canada. No. But that's, you know what I'm saying, right? What does God expect from us in these situations? And if you find yourself in a situation of compromise, what's keeping you from being a Daniel? peer pressure? Is it some kind of fear of losing something? If you're in a situation where you're faced with potentially compromising in your mind, what's keeping you from being a Daniel and representing him, of purposing in your own hearts, nailing down what it is you're not going to compromise on, but still doing what it is you need to do, right? And another question to think about is, what would it mean for you to purpose in your hearts not to defile yourself with things that are contrary to God's best for you? What does that mean? What would it mean for you? Would it cost you something? Would it cost you giving up something? Would it cost you adding something to your life? Is there a cost involved that's prohibiting you from engaging in this? Is that a problem? These are just questions to chew on, things to meditate on as you maybe read this chapter again later. And put yourself in Daniel's place. I mean, this is, I think, as far as I can remember, this is the only chapter in Daniel where there's no prophecy at all. This is what happened, and this is what the guys did. There's no visions, there's no interpretations, there's none of that. It's strictly God's will coming in and people finding themselves in this situation, and how do they deal with it? That's what it is. So, this conflict between God's sovereignty and man's sovereignty, if you will. What are you going to do when stuff happens? What are you going to do when your kid needs surgery? When you're going to fight God in this? What are you going to do when maybe the job is lost, or you get the job and it turns out this is not what I signed up for? What am I doing in this place now? What are you going to do when these things happen? Are you going to fight God in his plan? Because again, if God has a plan, nothing ever goes wrong with it. Ever. Ever, 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 ever. How often? Ever, never, never, nothing ever goes wrong with God's plan. It's when our plans conflict with God's plans that we find ourselves going, hey, what is up here? And probably the biggest way this is most applicable to all of humanity has to do with Jesus. Right? Garden of Eden. God makes man and woman. Man and woman disobey God, find themselves separated from God forever. Right? For all eternity, separated from God. But what does God do? God sends his Son to fix it, because these humans couldn't fix it themselves. You and I could not fix this ourselves. And so people ask, well, this is dumb. Why didn't God just make it so they couldn't sin? Why didn't God do this? Why didn't God do that? It's, you know what? God has a plan. He wrote all this out before eternity, before he said action. He said, this is how everything's going to play out. But at the same time, it says that before the foundation of the world, Jesus was slain. Jesus was sacrificed before. So it wasn't like God said, oh man, Adam and Eve blew it. What am I going to do? Quick. Never mind. I was going to say add baking soda, but that's a different story that we won't bring up right now. She gets it. Some of you get it. Anyway, God didn't react and panic and go, oh no, what am I going to do? He knew the whole time. But here we are going through our lives, and for thousands of years now, 6,000 years, every human finds themselves encountering this wall where they realize something's wrong. I can't fix this on my own. So it's this sovereignty of God, sovereignty of man conflict. And who's going to win? God's going to win, because he's bigger. And some other reasons. But what we as humans have to do is stop and say, I'm not going to fight God in this anymore. I'm going to surrender. I'm going to give up. Paul puts it like this. He says, I have been crucified with Christ. I give up. I die. I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. And the life that I'm going to live from now on, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. You hit that wall of God's sovereignty. Instead of fighting it and saying, God, I'm going to do it my way. I'm going to make you do it my way. You just got to say, that's it. I'm done. I give up. I surrender. And you can be, what Paul says, reconciled to God. Make peace with God. That's what he wants. That's been his will forever. What was God doing before he created everything? He was thinking of you. He was thinking of me. Just, my mind is blown. Completely gone thinking about that. But that's what he was doing. That's where he was at. So live life on purpose. Make a decision, purpose in your heart. Don't push it on anybody else, and then live it out the best that you can while you're here. Because you don't know how long you're going to be here. You might have that chance to be a witness to somebody, and it'll be cool. So let's pray about this. Let's pray about being Daniels.